Today we are talking about Chapter 6, and we're looking at how we connect our learners with some technology tools. And if you want to go to this section in your text and move through it as we go through in the lecture, that might be helpful to you as you're taking notes. So we are talking about some different functions, some Web 2.0 functions. This gives us a list here, and it also gives us some information about what does Web 2.0 actually mean. And we talked about that previously in a previous chapter, but just to refresh your memory. But today we're focusing on mashup, social networking, collaboration, cloud computing, open source, and websites that we can interact and publish data. So first off, open source is something that we love as teachers because it is free. It gives us free access and the ability to use it with our students at no cost. So open source is a beautiful phrase for teachers to hear. Cloud computing has really transformed how we save, how we operate, how we work. Now with many applications and many documents and large files and things of that nature. And many of you probably are very tied to different cloud systems. Mashups is something that has evolved over time. So at one point when we first started having various applications, teachers were using applications very individually. And then as they got more comfortable with those applications, they started to see, hey, this one can match with this and highlight in different ways. And so that essentially you're playing off of the strengths and weaknesses of different apps by bringing different resources together. And that's not just apps, that's also other tools as well that you put together. Social networking sources are something that are of great debate to teachers, and that is something that you're going to have to decide is that what you want to make available to your students, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the lecture. And then collaborative. So many times we want to have our students have a collaborative experience and connect together. And so some of these tools are really good to help facilitate that. So take a moment and look through or pause your video at this point and see if you can match the different Web 2.0 functions that you read about in the chapter with what's being described in each number. So take a moment and see if you can connect that. And now check your answers and see how well you did with each of those understanding. If you had some problems with that, maybe make a note to go back and review some of that in your notes. So let's head over to 120. That's where our case study begins. And we're looking at Miss Davis students. And they have some really interesting things to say about tools and teaching with tools.
Do you see yourself as proficient at knowing how to access internet tools and digital tools? And do you see you using this throughout high school and the college? Even though you know it's going to be changing, the software's going to be changing, but you don't.
Miss Vicki has one of the thing that she stresses the most is she lets us teach ourselves, and she does a great job because she realizes that software will change, but she allows us to have the power, the power for us to teach ourselves, so that way when the software does change, that we can be ready and we can teach ourselves. What's it called? She calls it intuitive learning.
Yeah. That's what she was talking about was the software sandbox. That's just letting us get on and play with it. And I think we learn better when we just get on and play with it. I mean, you can sit there and read a book or stand up there and let somebody talk to you about it. But until you do it, you're not going to understand it.
So this idea that the students talk about of playing with the tools is so very true, and that's why each week I list some tools for you to just play with, and hopefully you're finding some time to just play. It's during that play, and we know this from our early childhood majors will tell you this, our early childhood teachers will back this up, that playtime really does teach us a lot in our lives. And so hopefully you're using some time to play with tools. And then also the young lady in the video makes a really great point about the type of learning that they're just learning how to understand tools and how to facilitate a tool in their learning and understand directions and that type of thing. She's not teaching tools and that's all. There's a finite set of tools and we teach those and they move on and they use those the rest of their lives. Some of those tools will, by the time they leave college, those tools won't be in use anymore. And so they need to know the process of learning instead of just these specific tools. So here are some different resources that we can put into our instruction, blogs and wikis, and you have some examples and some detail in the book of how that can be integrated in. That's something that you feel like could be helpful in some of your classes with your students. Maybe you want to connect with that as some tools. And then there's also productivity apps, and those really help with collaboration. Sometimes, not all times, those are open source, but oftentimes we will find them as open source. And then there is social bookmarking, and so that way we can collaborate and share together different tools, different resources that we have. We also have different types of sharing, some things that are listed here with Pinterest, podcast, also other digital resources of how we share. We can do something as easy as making a Google Doc that we share with each other, all the way up to some other tools online that we use for sharing and creating portfolios or pin boards or things of that nature. There are social networks, and then, of course, the idea of mashups. So using different types of applications or different types of resources to come together and help our students use a variety of resources to accomplish their task. So I want you to take a moment and consider this that's listed in your chapter about some kindergartners, and they are connected with this fourth grade class that's also learning. And I want you to take a moment and go into the text and read about this particular scenario of technology integration. And I want you to think about, how could this work in your classroom? And I don't want you to think of this specific idea of they're starting to study insects. You may not study insects. That's okay. But I want you to think about the way that technology was integrated into this scenario and how could that connect to your classroom? What could you get from this scenario that you could apply to your own students? So oftentimes we think about using tools and we want to just use whatever tool's out there. We want a new tool comes along and it's a great tool and we like it. But we need to think about the right tools for the right learning situation. This chart gives us some ideas of how we will enhance student learning. So it's not that we just use technology tools because we just need to use technology. It's that we use these tools because they enhance the learning. And what that means, what it means to enhance the learning, is that if we did not have that tool, the learning environment, the learning situation would be different. And oftentimes that difference means that it would not be as quality of an experience or an environment. So, what we find by incorporating different technology tools is if we have the right tool for the right learning situation, we can enhance learning. And that's the goal of using technology in our learning. Oftentimes teachers or pre-service teachers say, I just don't want to just use technology to use technology. Well, nobody wants you to do that. We want you to use technology if it's the right tool and it enhances learning. And so this whole idea of, oftentimes people teacher educators are weary of using technology. They're unsure of it. But don't you want to use the very best tool for your students? And don't you want that learning situation to be the very best learning situation you can have? And if that means that there's a technology tool out there that will enhance it, why wouldn't you want to learn about it and use that for the betterment of your students? So take a second, look through these examples and see, and there's a variety of grade levels that are listed here in the examples. Look and see what are some things, and do you understand how it's enhanced, how the learning environment is changed because of that tool. Now, remember, you have a lot of different options. So, as a teacher, and this gives you one example with Edmodo of creating your own social networking site. If you look at this is very applicable to Facebook's setup. And what happens there is it's not necessarily that they want to copy how Facebook looks, but we're used to how Facebook operates. So if you use an interface that is similar to that, then people have a more intuitive way of coming into it and using it. It's not necessarily a copying situation. It's more of making the site better in an interactive way because we already have that setup of how to use it. So consider some different options. If you don't want to use more traditional social networking sites, this could be a possibility. Also consider the ideas of, and you can go out and you can find many examples of this, of paper-based lessons connected to social networking. So the idea of having a Twitter board that is in your room that's made of paper. Your students can, go put little heart stickers on to like different posts. That you can use Post-it notes to do posts, or however you want to set it up. There's a variety of ways. You can search that online and see what a lot of teachers have done different things. So it's not necessarily, I want to bring social networking sites into my classroom. Instead, start thinking about, my students are going to be on this eventually. So how do I help them learn to use it responsibly? And how do I help them learn how to write appropriately for these sites, respond appropriately to each other in a meaningful and an appropriate way? And how do I help them understand how to navigate what's truth and what's not truth? Because we know that there are social networking sites that do not track facts and do not do that for the viewer. And so your student needs to know how to navigate those sites. If you don't want to bring them into your classroom electronically, it's perfectly fine. But what's a way you could bring in aspects of it to teach them how to navigate? So if you go to page 130 in your text, you will see a selection rubric. And that rubric, this is just the top screenshot of it. It's much longer, much more in depth with a rubric. And it shows you how to select resources. And this is very much connected to that Assure model that we learned about in a previous chapter. You might want to mark this in your text or make a note for yourself to go back and look at this. So when you are selecting tools to use and finding resources and figuring out, is this a good resource, an appropriate resource, this would be a great selection rubric to use. And finally, we look at some advantages of using Web 2.0 for instruction. There's a lot of free stuff out there. There's a connectedness, portability. And then there are also some limitations. And consider those limitations of how you could embed aspects into your lessons to help avoid some of these types of limitations like bias and cyberbullying and safety issues. What's a way that you could avoid that in your lessons? So I want to take a moment as we finish this chapter to look ahead. So think about what's coming, and in the coming weeks, you'll be going into your lab assignment if you're an MAT student. But for MS students, I want you to do a similar assignment that you're going to do in your own classroom. So I want you to take some time and look ahead and read through that lab assignment, whether you're an MS student or MAT student, and start to see what ideas you have, what questions you have, and feel free to talk through it with me and ask any questions. I want you to go into that lab assignment prepared, but the first thing you'll need to do is read.